destination people always seem to find the magic and the mystery in this beautiful world. Don't get left behind.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Tom Anderson, and this is Webinar on Wednesday with Destinations Together. As always, a warm welcome to our Zoom listeners and cruise line executives that are tuning in. Today, there is so much positive news regarding the pandemic, including CDC guidelines, vaccinations, everything COVID-related. We're evolving into a new normal. River cruises are routinely operating on American rivers. There are plans to restart cruises in the Caribbean. Ships are sailing in the European bubble, and Singapore's cruises to nowhere are in full swing. Carnival just announced that 7 of their brands will be cruising this summer. So this all bodes well for the restart of cruise. Nevertheless, the cruise lines, port and tour operators have their work cut out. Strict protocols will need to be followed to ensure the health and safety of the onboard crew, the guests, and of course, those living in each destination. To achieve this, everyone must do their part. A perfect execution at every level will ensure a smooth operation and a swift expansion into longer duration cruises and more ports. As an example, Royal Caribbean and Genting Cruises have delivered their cruises to nowhere from the Port of Singapore since November for over 300,000 guests without incident. This is an important achievement which provides all of us with valuable perspective. Today's webinar focuses on the lessons learned from the Singapore's successful cruise operations. You will see how the close collaboration of all stakeholders, coupled with ongoing vigilance, provided a safe and healthy return to service. From today's session, you will have key takeaways that you can use immediately to help ensure a successful restart of cruise tourism in your destination. Today's presentation is hosted by Destinations Together, which is an open platform of relevant information and collaboration to support the tourism industry. As a reminder, both Larry and I have a wealth of experience in the cruise industry, especially as it relates to destinations shore excursions. Please contact us directly if we can be of assistance. I'll turn this over to Larry to share some important information and then introduce our moderator for today's Destinations Together webinar on Wednesday. Larry?
Hey, thanks, Tom. I want to thank you all for joining us today. First off, we would like to recognize our presenter from our webinar on March 31st, featuring the future tourism in a post-pandemic world with Dr. Albert Postma, professor at the European Tourism Futures Institute, Stenton University, Netherlands. Dr. Postma has shared with what he and his colleagues see in their virtual crystal ball of the future for the travel industry. Check out on our website his webinar as well as our past webinars. Before we begin, let me remind you of a few important housekeeping items. We are recording this webinar and we'll upload it to our website in the next few days. There is a question and answer tab below on your screens. We encourage you all to vote on questions listed in the Q&A to help ensure we include the most important ones. Please remember, we and our guests are only providing our opinions and possible sources for further intel. Stephen, please join me as I provide a quick introduction. Since November 2020, Singapore has been the home port for Royal Caribbean and Genting Cruises, both operating successful cruises to nowhere. Stephen Schwab, COO, Global Port Holdings, and CEO of Valletta Cruise Port, will moderate this panel featuring Lionel Wong, CEO of SATS Cruise Services, terminal operators for the Marine Bay Cruise Center, Singapore, and Dr. Tay from the Raffles Medical Group, who has been the healthcare partner for the Marine Bay Cruise Center, Singapore, since the start of the pandemic. They will provide a commentary and perspectives regarding how the team of stakeholders navigated the pandemic to ensure the safe restart of cruise ships from the Port of Singapore. With that being said, Stephen, please join us, and I'm going to turn it over to you and let you get the introductions going for the panels.
Thank you. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Tom. Thanks for your invitation in order for me to join you once again and moderating the session. Although we're discussing the cruise restart in Singapore, we of course, we will be tying this to relevant experiences also relevant to the Caribbean region. Of course, Singapore was blessed to have two cruise lines starting their operation there, RCCL and Genting. There are 2 ships currently in operation, and Singapore has to date handled over 300,000 passengers. And today on this webinar, I'm joined by Dr. Tay. He is a senior physician at Travels Medical Group in Singapore, with 12 years of experience in both the public and private medical practice. And he has assisted us in Singapore in the commencement of operations. So I'd like Dr. Tai to join to switch on the video himself. And I'm also joined by my colleague, our CEO of SATS Cruise Services in Singapore, the terminal operator of Marina Bay Cruise Center. And he is responsible for the direction and growth of the company and the daily operations of MBCCS since October 2014, so 15, sorry. So welcome, Lionel, as well. He has a wealth of experience in the cruise sector as well. And I'm sure they will both be happy to share their experiences so far in Singapore. So without further ado, I'll jump to the first round of questions. Starting with you, Lionel. Can you please take us through the process at first sight of the request to recommence cruising? How was the stakeholder engagement for the restart, your discussions with the government, with the health authorities, tourism authorities, etc.?
Well, good evening. Well, I say good evening because we are 12 hours ahead. So it's actually about 10 p.m. But I'll just get straight into it. The Singapore situation is whereby the government takes a very strong hand in planning and executing how the cruise industry restarts in Singapore. So sometime in October, we were approached by the Singapore Tourism Board to say that, hey, we want to restart cruising. We need to do certain things. We need to ensure that passengers get on board a ship are clean, all right? They are tested, and you need to learn about medical testing. You need to set up a test facility at the terminal. It's not something that any of us had ever done before. I think in this panel, outside of Dr. Tay, nobody else has ever seen a swab stick before, prior to the pandemic. So we learned about that. And then what was really important was when we sat down with the cruise lines to talk also about the various SOPs in terms of what to do if something were to happen, because you can plan to have all these testings and screenings for passengers and even for staff. But the real test of all your plans is what you do when something happens. And it's not a matter of if it's going to happen. It's going to be, in this pandemic, we know now, it's a matter of when it will happen. So all those drawer plans, they don't stay in the drawer for long. They will come out at some point, and that will be tested upon. Yeah. So the discussion is really, really critical. You need to talk to a healthcare partner to understand what your infection control possibilities are at the terminal. You need to talk to the cruise lines, because each cruise line would have their own health standards on board. The governments themselves will also have their own expectations in terms of health standards, what to do, what to respond with. You need to find out how do you activate in case you need to evacuate one COVID positive guest on board off to the nearest hospital. All of these plans need to be thought through. And many people, including your Ministry of Health, including your local governments, these are all the people that you need to talk to. And at the same time, you need to communicate all these risks to your staff, because people working at the terminal, some people would have an idea of what's going on. Some people they would be on the receiving end most of the time because they read what's available in the news. But now they're going to be working in a situation which exposes them to some risk. You can control the risk for sure, but they will be exposed to some risk. So how do you communicate that risk to your staff to manage their expectations, manage their morale? How do you have plans to look after them as well? So I think that's really what's also quite more important, rather than just for cruise lines and for other stakeholders, your staff and your co-workers are something that you shouldn't ignore.
So holding you on that thought, and I involve Dr. Tai in this. So what was the input of the Raffles Medical Group during the planning stage? And how was your receptiveness when you heard, Dr. Tai, that cruising is restarting? We all know we started in other ports also operating, but there's also the negative perception of the public. There's also the negative perspective of some sectors of government, for example. So how did you look into this? How did you mitigate this?
Yeah. Hi. Thanks for having me here. But Raffles Medical Group, we acted as the medical provider. And what we were told initially is that we needed to do swabs for all the cruise-going passengers, right? So the initial thought that came to my mind when we knew about this pilot for safe cruising was, to be honest, I was actually a bit skeptical, okay? Because especially when we heard about what happened on, for example, like the Diamond Princess cruise ship. I'm sure you guys heard of what happened then as well, the outbreak happening on the cruise ship and stuff. But the thing is that when we heard of all the measures that were slowly put in place by the various agencies and the various authorities and the ministry, we were actually more ready and excited to proceed. Okay, I'll probably describe it as like an extremely cautious approach. So really, as Lionel has mentioned, everything has been thought through, okay? And the important thing to look at was how to prevent a similar situation which happened on the said cruise ship from happening in Singapore. All right, and our focus really was, so our minds are all aligned. Our focus was really mainly to keep all parties safe, be it the crew, the passengers, and the staff at the terminal as well. All right, and all our plans were really all geared towards that. So if an outbreak was really to happen, so we do not want that to happen, right? But if it does happen, then it will really be definitely be a huge setback to restarting the cruise industry. I think on the first few cruises, everyone on their toes during the first few cruises, praying really, really hard that there were no COVID cases on board, because if that happened, you'll be all over the world, the news, right? So, but maybe I just want to touch on some of the measures that were actually put in place by the various agencies. I think these are more the practical aspects, and these actually made us more confident. Okay, so right at the start, these two cruises, Genting and Royal Caribbean, they were given the green light to offer cruises to nowhere in Singapore, and these are round trips, okay, and with no ports of call. A set of safety guidelines to prevent the onboard spread of COVID was developed. And the cruise lines, they were actually audited, and what they received was like a certificate, what we call a cruise safe certification, before sailing out of Singapore. So they need to get this certification before they're allowed to sail out of Singapore. And these cruise safe standards, what they included, include just to list a few. Number one, infection control, definitely, at every stage of the passenger's journey. All right. So be it at the beginning, including what they call a mandatory COVID-19 test prior to boarding the cruise ship, checking in and checking out at every location. So what they do, they have actually like a tag or like a chip, microchip. Everywhere they walk within a cruise ship, they'll have to check in and check out. That will actually help to facilitate like contact tracing. Alcohol hand rubs at multiple locations. I did a recce once on the cruise ships as well. Really, the alcohol swabs, you can see them really everywhere. So yeah, you're never far away from one, okay? And of course, strict and frequent cleaning and sanitization protocols on the ships. Safe management measures, meaning mask wearing all the time. Safe distancing measures on the cruise ship as well. Reduce ship capacity. So I think we started with about 50% as a ship capacity. Okay, so we and that will help to enable sufficient safe distancing measures, right? One more thing that I think the authorities looked at very, very closely was they wanted to ensure that there was 100% fresh air throughout the ship. All right, meaning that there was no recirculation of air. Okay, and that will hopefully prevent any outbreaks from happening within the cruise ships. One more thing to look at is that they also set up on-board measures to actually discourage close contact and intermingling between groups. So what I mean by this is that you actually have to book like reserve a slot if you want to go to the swimming pool. Okay, you can't just walk into the swimming pool just like that. There are reservations for the shows as well. So you can't just walk into the shows. There are different time slots. You first come, first serve, quickly book the show and the time slot that you want. Okay, and so all these measures all come into play, and I think they really were meant to instill confidence in the cruise industry, and therefore we are hoping to set a benchmark for the future of cruising within the region as well. Yeah.
Would you say there was a different approach towards passengers, crew, and employees of the terminal? Did you look at it differently, or no?
Yeah. So the passenger, the main thing we're looking at is actually if we're looking at passenger. So we actually group that into a few things. So you're right. So the crew safe certification, we are looking at providing an optimum and a safe environment. Okay, we're looking at the environment for the passengers, all right, from the crew safe certification and crew safe standards. So the next thing as a medical provider, I think what we are looking at was to, of course, ensure that the passengers and the crew are free from COVID-19. Okay, and then the third group that we're looking at is, of course, the contractors going up the ships when they dock. All right. So what we're tasked to do were pre-departure swaps. Initially, we did a post-arrival swaps as well, meaning after they come back from the cruise, we had to swap them as well before allowing them to exit the terminal. All right. There was what I call a rostered routing testing for the crew members. Okay, we do that weekly for them. And then we also deploy staff at all the temperature checkpoints as well. So if you're looking at the passengers first, so what we did, there was this close collaboration between Raffles Medical SATS, which is Linus' team, the Singapore Tourism Board, as well as the Ministry of Health. We actually had to set up an area for pre-departure swabbing and post-arrival swabbing. So quite interesting. If you look at behind Lionel, he was showing us his picture behind there. On the other side, that's where the car park is. So we actually came together and we drew out the plans, and then we discussed with Linus' team, and then we finally came up with we told them what we wanted, and we managed to convert the top floor of the multi-story car park of the terminal into a pre-departure swabbing center. Okay, so yeah, and what we did for the swabbing was antigen rapid testing. The results are out within 30 minutes, and this was used for all the swabs. Okay, right now for Genting, we're using this antigen rapid testing as a pre-departure swab, but for Royal Caribbean, they chose to use the PCR testing. Okay, but that was done by another medical provider. Okay, so the general, yeah. So
I was turning back to Lionel on this. So Lionel, once the restart commenced, okay, what in your view were the major challenges you faced? And I'd like you also to answer, what was your employees' response, Lionel? Did you have any of your staff refusing to come to work because they were scared to provide services to guests who could potentially be carrying COVID? I mean, we're not immune to it from the cruise side, of course. So what is, in your view, were the main challenges faced at the beginning?
Okay, so the biggest challenge we had is when you have a big gap between non-cruising and cruising, the hardest thing that the cruise lines had to achieve would be getting the sales momentum, right? Getting the passengers to have confidence in the brand, have confidence in the measures, and then getting on board, understanding that the itineraries now are a little bit different, understanding that the programs on board are a little bit different, and eventually adopt, for the market to adopt it. Then for the staff, I'd say, thankfully, we didn't have a lot of problems, because for the staff, we communicated to them quite well. And I think we'll touch on this a bit later. We went through that cruise dorm project, and those staff that are with us now also went through that project, and that project was a lot more sensitive. So they got desensitized in that sense, right? They got immune to the scariness of the virus during that project. And so when it came to this particular part of the restart, then it was a lot easier for them. But the biggest hurdle, I'd say, to the entire momentum of restarting cruises was the swab itself. Because that at that time, this last year in October, there were a lot of very funny rumors about swabs. Some say it goes all the way in, it'll puncture your membrane and enter the brain. Some say it will, scratch all the way down to your nose. It scratch your throat, and it gives you all that kind of stuff. When actually what we are doing with respect to the antigen rapid test, it's a 1 centimeter depth into your nose. It's just here. It's the same depth as if you were to stick your finger into your nose and dig it. Okay, it's the same depth. So that cotton bud, or rather that swab stick, goes in, twirls, and comes out. So that took a while, took maybe about 2-3 months for the word to really get out and say, hey, it's actually okay. The swab is not as bad as we thought. And eventually, so the cruises started, we were allowed to do 50%. So if you're familiar with Quantum of the Seas is about 5,000 passengers. So you know about 50% is about 2,000, 2004, around there. It really took about 3 months, I'd say, about 2 months, sorry, to reach the kind of sales momentum to start from about 1,000 odd passengers to reach 2,000 plus. So it took that while for the word to get out to the market and say, hey, this is a viable holiday alternative and it's safe. Because in Singapore at that time, we also had staycations at hotels. People could book themselves in hotels, stay for the weekend and all that. But these, because we had very, very low viral cases, we had very, very, very small number of community cases at a time, there was no need to do testing for these staycations. Whereas the cruise lines were held to a much higher standard. We tested every passenger, we tested all the staff, we tested all the contractors, we tested all the crew. So that means, and it's not just the testing, if you show up at the terminal with a running nose, it could well be a sinus. We still turn you away. So anybody that gets on board the ship is devoid of symptoms and has a negative test result. Yeah. So we proved to the market that it was really, really safe. You get on board, you are mingling with people who are, in that sense, quite clean. So that was really, really the hurdle, I'd say. It was really the market perception behind the swabs, behind the discomfort, and getting people to understand that the standards that we had were really quite strict.
Lionel, Singapore can boast of a massive terminal. You can see it behind you, and I've been there, and it's really, really massive. And most of the audience here, we have an audience which is predominantly from the Caribbean. We have very, very small terminals, if any terminals at all. So would you say that even with a big terminal, did you have any social distancing issues? Did these pose certain challenges? If certain people, like you mentioned now, a guest turns with some symptoms, even though if it's a sinus, you had to isolate them, right? So how did you tackle that in a terminal like yours, which is quite massive and you can do it? So we want to take some takeaways from this, how you handle the social distancing, because of course, the learning from here in order to, for the other ports listening in the Caribbean, we need to understand how this was handled. But of course, with a mind that we have more smaller terminals in the Caribbean, for example.
Okay, so I need to correct a misconception here. Yes, you are right. We have a large terminal right here. This is the terminal building, as you know, right? This is hardly used. Okay, let me explain why. Because at that time, when we started learning about the virus, we knew that the virus, maybe it's not so much defined as airborne, but it is at least spread by aerosol. Okay, that means somebody sneezes, it could possibly linger in the air. Now, imagine if it was really found out to be airborne, like what the WHO is saying now. This poses a problem because now I have a very complicated air conditioning system, okay, that can potentially harbor residual viruses, right? So very early on, what we did was, other than we scrub the air cons, right? So we clean the AHUs or the air handling units. We cleaned them, we treated them with UV lights and so on and so forth. But what really was the case was because when we tested people, we tested them here. This is the car park, it's open air. And we worked very closely with the cruise lines, as I mentioned. It's a stakeholder thing, right? It's a collaborative thing to stagger the arrival of the passengers to the terminal. You can't have 500 people showing up at one time. You need to have 200 so you can manage them in half-an-hour blocks. That's what we did. And because you have this testing facility, by the time they get the results and they're released in smaller batches of about 10, 20, 15, or even 30. They enter this part. It's basically an empty building. So when they enter this part, they breeze through check-in, they breeze through immigration, and they pretty much walk to the ship within 15 minutes of stepping into this building. Okay, so this acted as a filter for us. Now, because it's open air and because we could stagger down the people arriving at the terminal, we now have a capacity here. Yes, it's big space. I understand in the Caribbean, you have very little building space, but you have more open space, which is a good thing in this case, because you want open space. You want to have people spaced out, seated apart while they wait, maybe with a tent, maybe with some fans to keep the air ventilation going, but you want to keep them outdoors. Because despite the fact that we're testing, we all know nowadays there are asymptomatic cases, right? You can never be sure if the guy sitting next to you is or is not an asymptomatic case. Yeah. So because of that, you still want to make sure all these precautions are kept there. You keep everybody apart. You test everybody before they ever enter an enclosed environment. And even if they do, this is what we consider a transient contact. Means that they move in, they move out, they do not dwell for longer than 15 to 20 minutes. Right? So
that's perfectly understood. Of course, you're looking at this from a home porting perspective. So you can give the passenger a time window when to embark. But in reality, and you are operating what we call a blue cruise, it's going to nowhere and it's coming back. So you can fairly control that experience and the arrival times. But once the cruising is back with a vengeance in the Caribbean and in all the other ports, and I'm looking at it from a port of call, a transit call point of view, where you have passengers coming down at the same time and departing at the same time. So, Dr. Tai, what in your view, what is your advice to the ports in this respect, to transit ports when they're handling larger passenger movements at the same time? Of course, one can always argue that, listen, these passengers would have been tested before because they're coming from the cruise line and they're supposedly all tested before embarkation. But still, at this moment in time, we want to avoid crowds of people as much as possible. So what is your advice on this?
I think importantly, even if there are different groups of people coming in, one of the most important things to do is you still have to separate them. Okay, we still have to find a way to separate the different groups coming in. All right, so meaning that if this, and we have to stagger the timing all the time. All right, so if this cruise is coming in at this time, let's say 8 a.m., that's fine. The next cruise that comes in probably have to come in the afternoon. So it cannot be too concentrated. Okay, so meaning we can probably have maybe 2 or 3 cruises coming in a day. All right, and importantly is that we'll probably have to direct them to different locations to get, if let's say going into any swabs or and stuff like that, and to direct them to different locations to get it done as well. Okay, so I think because you're talking about your terminals, there maybe it's small, but yeah, as Lionel mentioned, I think important things to identify is where you can do your swabbing. Could it be outside in a car park, or could it be in, for example, another multi-purpose hall, which could be actually be away from the location? All right, and then you can get all the swabs done there, and then you may get like a shuttle bus, for example, to ferry the passengers to the terminal. I think this way that's how you can do some crowd control. You see, if they're all to just concentrate at the terminal, then I think that's a major problem. You should be avoiding that at all costs. Okay, because just one C plus and then that's it. I'm not sure how you're going to contact trace, and it'll be a nightmare. Okay, so yeah, I think it's still very, very important to really separate it out and to make the timings really separate them out, and you do not concentrate anything together. Yeah. Yeah,
understood. So crowd control is of paramount importance, whether it's onshore or ashore. Okay, so one of the challenges we're facing with this pandemic is the ever-changing dynamic of the virus. Only 2 days ago, Singapore has announced there's heightened health safety measures, right? So these are the challenges we as a cruise industry will have to face. How did this heightened security health safety measure impact the operations in Singapore from a medical perspective and from an operational perspective?
Yeah. So medically, I think that the thing to look at is that whatever plans that you come up with, it is really important to remember that this coronavirus is very unpredictable. Okay, and things can really change overnight. Basically, what happened in Singapore in just a matter of days, we are no longer allowed to dine in. Okay, so last week we were having Mother's Day dinner and stuff like that, and this week we just have to stay at home. Only takeaways are allowed. Okay, and how about the cruises? The cruise capacity was reduced from 50% to 25% just overnight. Okay, 2 weeks ago we were having like 1,700, 2,000 passengers. Today, from what I heard, for today's cruise, I think the number was probably just about 500 plus to 600. Okay, and that was just like, you know, overnight kind of thing. And the restaurants on board are actually closed. Okay, so they have to either go through room service or like a grab and go kind of thing, or on a cruise. Live singing will also no longer be allowed. Okay, because of this heightened health safety measures. And then there's this issue about the variants. Currently, unfortunately, we are seeing this strain B1617 strain locally. This strain was first identified in India sometime in probably October last year. And it seems like this strain can spread more efficiently and it can affect children more. Last year, we hardly had any kids getting infected with COVID, okay? But in this current spike of community cases that we're seeing right now, we're really seeing quite a fair bit of children being infected. Okay, so as of now, we have actually closed our schools starting today. So same thing, you know, this is like within this 1 week, now our schools are closed and our kids have to start doing home-based learning once again. And yeah, so in a matter of 1 week, our world seems to have changed completely once again, you know. So I've always mentioned this in the talks that I give regarding COVID-19 to some of our other partners. One thing to remember is that no one is safe until everyone is safe, okay? Meaning that if, let's say, your country is fully vaccinated, another country's vaccination rate is 20%, that's a problem. Because if community spread is rampant in country B, for example, variants will appear, and sooner or later these variants will appear back in this country A. Okay, so important that you really have backup plans or drawer plans, and because it is a matter of time when even this variant will probably be appearing in the Caribbean as well, you know. So yeah, it's a matter of when, not really if. See, so yeah.
Lionel.
Yeah. So one thing I can say, if there are any terminal operators in the audience, really identify your core team. You need to protect your core team because at any one point in time, a cluster can happen, right? Out of anywhere, out of anybody. It can just start without you telling this. And if you don't protect your core team, you're going to find out that eventually when the cluster does break out, and assuming they're all infected, you're not going to have anybody to run your port. So you need to have team A, team B, you know, it's basically BCB things, but you have to go to extremes in some cases, like for example, what we're doing now to ensure this period, our core team is protected. All our staff members are able to go from home to office in the private transportation, whether it's a taxi or whether it's through an Uber or in our case, it's a Grab, you know, it's a private car rather than taking public transport. And it'll cost a bit more, you know, but this is something, I mean, if you consider the alternatives, if they're not protected, if somebody catches something, then it's a lot more serious. So the spacing wise is also something, as I mentioned, you know, you've got to keep yourself up to date with all these habits of the variants, read up on all these medical directives from the CDC and see what is it you can learn, what is it you can glean about the behavior of the virus. Don't wait for them to tell you to say, hey, switch off all the air cons or spread out the chairs. No, read up on it, take that decision, be proactive. So that's the only way you can stay ahead of the game, or in this case, stay ahead of the virus.
Yeah, very, very sound advice, Lionel. A commendable initiative that came about when we were preparing for this webinar was, you know, your initiative as Singapore in order to give some much needed relief to migrant workers on board the cruise ships. Some of them have been stuck for months without any shore leave, etc. But you helped them out during this difficult period. So can you please share with the audience, because I think we haven't heard it in previous webinars yet, what Singapore did. So can you share this experience with the audience?
Okay, so just to give some context, Singapore takes in, I think, about 300,000 or 400,000 of these migrant workers. This is basically our labor force. So when we need to build a house, you need to build a tunnel or whatever, these migrant workers, they come in, they come from all different countries. You've got Bangladesh, you've got India, you've got Myanmar, you've got Thailand, you've got everywhere around our region. And they live in dormitories in the country. And when the pandemic broke out, there was an outbreak in these dormitories. And it came up to the point, I think about 35 to 40,000 of them were infected. And there was a mad rush in the country to isolate them from the general population, get them into accommodations, treat them, look after them, make sure that they're fed, make sure that they're cared for. And one of the options that the government took on was to have 2 cruise ships berthed at my terminal to look after 8,000 of these workers over a span of 5 months. And in these 5 months, we looked over 8,000 of them. They moved in, they moved out. Effectively, I, as a cruise terminal operator, became a dormitory manager. Okay, something I have never done in my life. So we also deal with these workers from a day-to-day basis, because some of them, they are the building maintenance people in the building. Some of them, they are cleaners that will be hired. But I've never had to look after 8,000 of these people at one time. And when you deal with a group here, which was scared because they caught the virus, they had recovered from it, they don't know what's going to happen to them after. They came to the ship to be cared for. They don't know what's going to happen with the job. So there's all this uncertainty. So we had to bring in like Dr. Tay's team to really provide them 24/7 healthcare. And I know for a fact, Dr. Tay himself, he intercepted a couple of heart attacks from these migrant workers, and he saved their lives. We all had to bring in mental health counseling for some of these people because they were stuck in a cruise ship. They're not used to being confined in a cruise ship. And a cruise ship was never meant for you to stay for longer than maybe 21 days. Even if you take a cruise ship around the world, you get to walk along the deck and all that. These guys, no, they were stuck in the room. They were confined in the cabins for 7 days, 14 days, and most before we were able to transfer them to other dorms. And at that time, we had to do so because we didn't understand yet how the virus fully behaved. So we thought we had to keep them isolated so that the crew on the ship were protected. Eventually, we realized that after that, because they're recovered and they were no longer infectious, they could come out as long as the crew had PPE, your personal protective equipment, then these migrant workers could still come out. They could roam the ship a little bit, have a bit of freedom, stretch their legs a little bit, and that improved their mental health quite a bit at that time as well. But I'll leave it to Dr. Tay to explain more about the medical stuff. But that was really a critical learning phase for us, because that was when we, as a terminal operator, came face to face with the impact of the virus at our workplace. How do we deal with it? How do we deal with a case that comes up he's supposed to be recovered, but we checked he's still got acute respiratory infection. How do we treat him? Do we isolate him? Do we send him off to the hospital? And also for our staff, how to protect themselves.
So this was prior to the commencement of cruising per se. This was prior to.
It's prior. So this 5 months was a crash course in infection control for us. Doctors take 6 years to learn about this. We learned it in 5 months.
Yeah. So basically you had 2 floating hospitals at the terminal, or isolation facilities, let's call them.
Yeah, isolation facilities. I'd say something like that. But although they were pretty much more like home after a while.
Yeah. Any further input on this, Dr. Tay?
Yeah, I think we really worked really closely with Lionel and his team at that time. Interestingly, what we did was in the arrival hall, so there's a huge hall, right? What we did was that we set up 2 sick bays in that area, okay? And these sick bays had like vents coming out from them to like prevent recirculation of the air and so on and so forth. And of course, the migrant workers, as mentioned, they're all recovered COVID patients. Initially, my job then was really to look after them daily. Okay, so basically, the crew center became like my workplace. I was there every morning looking after them. And then after, that's where we call the reporting sick hours. That's when they come and they can report sick and they come to see me. Okay, after reporting sick hours, if they need to have any medical attention, it's actually all done by teleconsultation with my colleagues back at our hospital. But the nurses, they are present there at the sick bay 24/7. So I think as mentioned, Lionel has mentioned initially, we were sending all these patients who came in with like a sore throat, cough, runny nose to our CDC. Okay, and we realized that in the end, it's not really an efficient thing to do because in the end, no PCR swabs were done for them. Nothing was done for them. They just go there, say hi, and they come back. Okay, and we discussed with our ministry, with the Ministry of Health, and we agreed that the chance of reinfection was really very, very low, especially during the first 3 months post-recovery. And so what we did was that we had 2 sick bays, right? One, we reserved it for the migrant workers who had all this cough, sore throat, runny nose, okay? And the other one was for all the non-infectious conditions, like mental health and things like that, right? So, and for all the other conditions that do not need monitoring, for example, like headache, back pains, we'll just send them back to their cabins. Okay, but yeah, one of the main challenges that we faced was really the mental health issues, anxiety, claustrophobia. We had social workers coming in every week. At one point, my entire sick day was with migrant workers with anxiety issues. So in there, we actually had a bond with them. We were like taking photos, and when they're leaving, we felt quite sad when they're leaving as well. So, but it was a good run. I was telling Lionel that it was a really very good run. Yeah, and talking about heart attacks, that's one interesting thing to look at as well, because I think even recent studies have shown that after COVID patients have recovered, they have an increased tendency of getting blood clots. Okay, so even young migrant workers who were totally well with no medical problems, they can actually get a heart attack. So a challenging thing which I had to do then was really to differentiate whether is it really a heart attack or is it just like a gastric problem, gastric pain, gastric reflux, because communication issues, when they come in, even with gastric reflux, they'll just say, my chest is painful. They'll just say pain, and I can't really I can't send all the patients complaining of chest pain to the emergency department. That the paramedics will really hate me for this, you know what I mean? So, but in the end, yeah, we still managed to pick up a few heart attacks, and thankfully they were sent to the emergency department in a timely manner. But I think as a medical provider and having our presence at the terminal during that 5-6 months, hopefully it gave the migrant workers some reassurance and comfort, that all their medical needs are really looked into throughout their stay on the cruise ships. Yeah,
this was a very commendable thing to do. So switching back to operations now, we have touched upon the preventative and the mitigation measures. I would like both of you to tackle a bit the aspect of how you tackled a positive case. When a positive case is detected, what happened? We had instances in Europe, for example, when 2 different families are coming together to the port, they share a van, one of the passengers was found positive, and the whole group was sent back, even though they were just on the van for a couple of hours. So how did you tackle positive cases?
Okay, so first we need to define what positive means. In our terminology, you have antigen positive, right? The other one you have is COVID positive from a PCR test. So these are 2 different scenarios. What we do when we test at the terminal is antigen. When that's positive, we send that particular passenger along with the family to the hospital for a PCR test. Okay, that cruise is gone for them. It's gone for them. They'll be given a chance to rebook, but pretty much that day it's gone. They're not going to get the results in time. But at the same time, there are also comms out, to tell people that, oh, this is your test. Please try to arrange your own transportation, not to share and all that, because if there is a case of close contact, then as you say, Stephen, the whole group is affected. But again, because it's an antigen case in our case, we don't assume automatically that they are COVID positive. We assume this is antigen positive. It could well have been a false positive. And so far, thankfully, every single case we picked up has been a false positive. So we treat these people as non-COVID infectious. The big question now is, what if the C+ case is found on board? So the process is like this. If the person shows up with a symptom at the ship clinic, the person is tested at the ship clinic itself. Once that's found to be C+, the ship would isolate that person into an isolation cabin. The ship turns back to Singapore. The sample is then sent to our local land lab for retest again. If that's confirmed to be positive, the passenger is offloaded, okay, through a different route in both the ship as well as the terminal. So that even though I have to sanitize the passenger boarding bridge on the terminal, the other passengers on the ship who get off the ship, they don't use the same passage. They are given completely separate routes. You need to do that because you need to understand you have a green channel, red channel. You don't want them to mix, because in case if the virus happens to linger somewhere, then you don't want other people to catch something like that, right? So these are things you have to be very closely planned together. And then most importantly is what happens to the family of that person that could be C+. Those are what we call now PUQs, people under quarantine. The government will now quarantine them because they are considered close contacts. They also come down through the separate path, different from the main population, and they are then sent off to a quarantine facility. Again, I speak from the perspective of a home port. In this case, I would say the model that the Caribbean probably would need to look very closely at is what MSC is doing in Italy, whereby you have the ship going from Civitavecchia to Naples to Palermo or maybe to Malta. It's a circle loop. But when something happens at one point, what do they do with that one point? Do they bring it back to Civitavecchia, or they do it at the next port? And then they find a way to transport the passenger back, or do they treat that passenger on that spot itself? So I think that model is something that the Caribbean needs to examine. And
Yeah,
sorry, Stephen, just let me finish.
No, yeah, continue.
In our case here, because we are the home port, we are the start and finish of the journey, we control quite a lot of these standards. Whereas in the case of Italy for MSC, the cruise line is the one that does all this planning, because different countries, different ports, different states will have different medical standards. It's better to have one single standard. Everybody agrees on a one single standard and one single executor. Otherwise, too many cooks, you get a very, very weird broth, So in this case, that certain channel, I think, Stephen, you probably know better since they are calling on your port. I think that's the model that the Caribbean should really look at.
In fact, I was going to mention something from my experience with MSC. In fact, the Maltese government only accept a cruise ship in with a clean bill of health. So if there is one case on board, that ship is only allowed to do a technical stop in Malta. That's the situation now. So that poses a lot of challenges. But I want to tie what you were saying to a question that just came in from the audience. Was the government receptive to the idea of restarting operations? Because of course, I'm sure you have discussed this. What happens if there's a case on board? What happens if the health system is overwhelmed with cases? So how did that discussion with the authorities go?
Okay, so in our case, it may seem to be a bit of the opposite. In our case, the authorities were the ones who wanted to restart it. Okay, so the initiative came from them. They said, okay, guys, let's do this as an industry thing. It's not so much Singapore wants to do this. It's not so much the cruise lines want to do this. We do this together. And because we do this together, everybody sits down and discusses how we do it. So for example, as Stephen, you mentioned, a cruise ship that comes in without a clean bill of health. Okay, let me give an example. Sometime last year in March, Costa Fortuna. Okay, this was during the outbreak period when Italy was going mad. Okay, nobody wanted to take in ships with Italians on them. That was the unfortunate, plain reality. Okay, we said, hang on, Costa Fortuna left from Singapore. She sailed off for 8 days. She went to other ports. We will allow her to come back, okay? Because she sailed from us. We are the home port. We will take that. We'll take that bite, and we will help you. So she came back, and we got the help of Costa in that sense to segment the passengers. And there was something else that we did. We worked very closely with the airport, whereby there were, I think, about 100 or so Italians that came from the red zone. Okay, they came specifically from the red zone. We collected these passengers through the shelter. We bused them on specific coaches straight to the plane, not even stepping through the airport. Yeah, they went straight to the plane, immigration cleared, everything cleared, they flew home. The Italian ambassador himself came down to the terminal, he saw the operation, but I think the whole point is here, this is a pandemic, everybody's suffering. So to say that, if you don't have a clean bill of health, I don't accept you. I can understand it from a public health standpoint, because if I'm an authority and I have no way to protect my population, then that is probably a decision I have to take. That is a way, but that's not the only way. For example, as like what we did, we worked with the Italian, I think there was some discussion with the Italian government to say, hey, could we fly them back? If you're prepared to fly them back, we will take them in, we will offload them, and then we'll send them onto the plane, they can go off. So there was that whole collaboration with the government, and it really is the government. It's because at that time, I was called in by two ministries. You had Singapore Tourism Board, as you also had the Ministry of Transportation, who were involved in this project. And it was a pretty large project in the sense that, even though it's just one cruise ship and with 100 or so of them, but in the sense that it really required a lot of coordination between all stakeholders, everybody. So you can't say, oh, I want to go to the government and say, government, you've got to be receptive because of these reasons. No, they need to see sense. Yeah. They need to see that they have a part to play. If they don't recognize that they have a part to play, that is your number one problem. Everybody must recognize that this is a industry, or rather, it's everybody's game together. It's not just your game or his game or her game. No, everybody needs to play a single role in doing this together. Otherwise, it will never work.
Understood. Something else. Till now, we have seen bubble cruising and blue cruising. So do you see this foreseeable in the short to medium term? The reason why I'm asking this, because many destinations here with us today, especially coming from port cities, they depend on cruise tourism, but not only. They depend on independent guests. And even where we are operating in Valletta, we're receiving cruise guests, but we're not seeing any independent guests. No one is allowed to wander around the city alone unless accompanied by the cruise representative on a pre-organized tour. When do you think we will get out of this bubble blue cruising? And Dr. Tai, do you think that the only way forward is once we start seeing mass vaccination worldwide?
I think in the near future or in the foreseeable future, bubble cruising will still be the way to go, unfortunately. Okay, because different countries have got different standards, different countries have got different prevalence of the COVID cases, different countries have different variants of the COVID virus as well. We do not want them mixing around. So we have to trust the bubble that we are creating, right? And hopefully that doesn't cause more problems. If we can't just open up to everybody. If you're talking about vaccination, so if you're looking at the cruise industry post-vaccination, unfortunately, vaccinated individuals can still be infected. Okay, I mean, we are seeing that even locally now in our recent increase in community cases. Although such individuals, they tend to be asymptomatic or they have mild symptoms only, but they can still be infected, they can still pass the virus to somebody, okay? Although the chances is reduced, all right? So please be vaccinated, yeah? There are also talks on whether this current vaccine that we have is effective against the variants as well. They are emerging around the whole world. Because even with vaccinations going on in many countries around the world today, I think I need to say this again, nobody is safe until the world is safe or vaccinated, okay? And I think the recovery of the cruise industry really hinges on this. And really till then, for the foreseeable future, it will still be a very careful, calibrated approach with all the safety measures and protocols in place. Currently in Singapore, people who have been fully vaccinated, they do not need to undergo what we call a pre-event testing. For example, if there are meetings, there are weddings above a certain number of attendants, they have to undergo a pre-event testing. But if you have been fully vaccinated, you do not need to undergo the pre-event testing. So now the question is whether can we apply this to the cruise operations, right? And of course, we are still waiting for further guidelines on this, but I think some things to consider. Number one, the number of people on the cruise ship is really a lot larger than that allowed for the events that we're talking about, meetings and weddings and stuff like that, okay? The second thing to think of is that, the passengers will be on the ship for a few days compared to these events you're talking about just for a few hours, right? And that's it, okay? And one last thing to look at is, of course, the prevalence of COVID in the country. If the prevalence is still high, despite ongoing vaccinations, I'll still continue performing the swab test. All right. So yeah, I think there's still a way to go. Like even if the whole world slowly gets vaccinated, but really, yeah, we still have to wait and see.
So I was going to ask each one of you to pinpoint two major takeaways. One thing that you must definitely do, and one other thing that you should avoid. I start with you, Dr. Tay. I think one thing you should do is get vaccinated. You just mentioned it now.
Yes.
So I would say, what is one thing that even the cruise operators here should avoid? And then I'll ask Lionel to give us his two main takeaways from this webinar.
One thing that we should definitely avoid, I think we have talked about this as well, is being complacent and letting your guard down. Okay, because just as I mentioned, within 1 week, we have closed our restaurants, we've closed our schools, so things can really happen just like that because the coronavirus is just so unpredictable. And really important because of this is that you need to have backup plans, you need to have drawer plans, as the pandemic can really change in either direction just overnight. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't let your guard down. Very, very important. Thank you. Lionel.
Okay. So do I talk about the don't do or the do?
One and one.
Okay.
One in 1 minute.
I think I'm going to tie what you should do with your previous question, which is also very much to do with how do you see bubble cruising or cruises to nowhere. I think the approach to this should be not so much whether or not it's going to be bubble cruising or cruises to nowhere, but let's look at it from the Cirque du Soleil model, whereby they said they could create a circus without animals, and they created it, right? And we all know in the world how successful this business is. So in this case, also very much with all these changes of 25% max passenger load, no in-room dining and all that, it has forced Royal Caribbean and Genting to reinvent their on-board product. Okay, and I think yes, today the FIT passenger, the independent passenger, it's pretty much not going to exist anymore, at least until we get this thing into control. But that's the magic question. But really, as a port of call, how then can you reconfigure your product to fit largely groups, largely this kind of market? I think that's really the takeaway that you should have. How do you, like the way what we did? We became a dorm manager when I had no clue how to do it. So how do you reinvent yourself in a new form in this pandemic such that you could deliver more value to a new market that you have never addressed before, or an old friend, an old market that you have always addressed, but you want to revitalize. So I think this is a critical takeaway. The one thing I would not do is think that this thing has been beaten, okay, ever. Even though it goes underground, even though suddenly we have, it all disappears. seemingly, I think we should really be very careful, because I think what this particular virus has shown us in the last 1 year is that it's extremely unpredictable, and it is pretty much ahead of the curve. It's ahead of everything that we do. So we need to really be very careful about this virus. Don't take it for granted. Get vaccinated. Yeah.
So perfect. I think we have consensus here that don't let your guard down. I think this is a key message here for everyone. The virus has been unpredictable, and it's very important that we, as port terminal operators and destinations, we are alert and we have to be responsive to the changing environment, and we have to be responsive. And I think engaging all the time, not only with our guests and with the cruise lines, but with the local community, with the governments, is key to all this. So thank you for listening. I'll pass the word to Tom and Larry in order to do the concluding remarks.
Well, thank you all very much. That's a fascinating presentation. I just to top off what you were saying, Stephen, I also wanted to kind of underscore what Lionel was saying, to leave our listeners with that question of the onboard product has been reinvented in many aspects, and I think one of the takeaway challenges for those of us in various ports is, how do you reinvent your port, your venue, your attraction to be able to work in this environment? Larry?
Yes, fantastic, and thank you all, and Stephen for moderating. That was fabulous.
Thank you.
So again, thank you all. Appreciate it. Do want to mention our next webinar, which is Wednesday, June 9th at 12 noon. This session will explore one of the ongoing challenges of tour operations. What does it take to build a scalable shore excursion that is representative of the destination, supports sustainable growth, beneficial to all stakeholders, and meets the financial goals of the cruise lines and the tour operator? Diverse panel moderated by Jeff DeVito, storyteller at GD Synergy, will thoroughly discuss the important destination positive topic focused on reasonable and sustainable tourism. Again, please visit us at our website, www.destinationstogether.com, to register for our future webinars. And again, don't hesitate to socialize it. Many thanks to you all for continued support. Tom and I really appreciate it. Be strong, be safe, and be healthy. And Stephen, Lionel, and Dr. Tay, again, many thanks for being here with us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Won't you set me free? I'll take a train, a plane, a big cruise ship. It doesn't really matter to me. Destination people always seem to find the magic and the mystery in this beautiful world. Don't get left behind.